The first pale ribbon of dawn stretched across the eastern sky as Duke Nathaniel Ashcroft stood alone upon the balcony of Ashcroft Hall, watching sunlight spill over forests, rivers, and villages that legally belonged to him but somehow felt farther away each passing year. Servants already hurried through the palace below, polishing silver, arranging flowers, and preparing for another gathering of noble families eager to place their daughters before the kingdom's most eligible bachelor. Nathaniel barely noticed. At 34, handsome, respected, and unimaginably wealthy, he possessed every privilege a man could inherit, yet every introduction sounded painfully alike. Every graceful smile lingered just a heartbeat too long upon his title. Every compliment carried the weight of calculation. Every conversation ended with another subtle reminder that becoming Duchess of Ashcroft was a prize worth pursuing. No one ever seemed interested in discovering the man beneath the crest. That morning he quietly abandoned the banquet before it began. An elderly priest traveling through the estate had recently shared an unexpected story while warming himself beside the palace hearth. Deep within a remote farming valley lived a young woman named Elena Whitfield, 24 years old, whose beauty was mentioned only after people described her character. According to the old man, she had refused prosperous merchants, wealthy ranch owners, and ambitious landowners because she believed kindness mattered more than comfort. Whenever neighboring farms suffered poor harvests, mysterious baskets of grain, vegetables, and fresh bread appeared outside struggling homes before sunrise. Everyone suspected Elena, yet she never admitted anything or accepted thanks. The priest finished with quiet certainty. If you wish to know whether goodness still lives in this kingdom, ride there. Those words lingered far longer than any polished speech spoken inside court. Nathaniel summoned only his oldest steward, Arthur Pembroke, a man who had served 3 generations of Ashcrofts and knew silence better than gossip. Together they prepared a simple disguise. Expensive coats disappeared beneath coarse linen. Fine leather boots gave way to worn work boots stained by honest labor. The jeweled signet ring bearing the Ashcroft crest was wrapped carefully inside a strip of cloth and hidden deep within his saddlebag. Arthur watched with worried eyes. "Your Grace," he murmured, "the council will search every county." "They may search," Nathaniel replied softly. "For once, I would rather be found as a man than recognized as a duke." Before sunrise the following morning, he rode alone through rolling hills, leaving behind marble halls for dusty roads lined with cedar trees and endless meadows. The farther he traveled, the quieter the world became. Grand estates disappeared, replaced by weathered barns, grazing cattle, wooden fences, and children laughing barefoot beside narrow streams. The scent of polished stone gave way to fresh soil, wildflowers, and pine carried gently upon the wind. For the first time in years, every breath felt strangely uncomplicated. By late afternoon he reached Whitfield Valley. Golden wheat swayed beneath the summer breeze like waves upon a quiet sea. Small cottages rested among orchards heavy with fruit. Smoke drifted lazily from stone chimneys while horses grazed peacefully beside split-rail fences. Nothing appeared wealthy, yet nothing seemed neglected. The valley possessed a quiet dignity that money could never purchase. He soon found the Whitfield farm. An elderly farmer swung an axe with practiced strength despite silver threading through his beard. Nearby, an older woman gathered vegetables into woven baskets while humming a gentle hymn. Their modest farmhouse showed years of careful repairs rather than expensive improvements. Everything reflected patient hands instead of overflowing pockets. Nathaniel dismounted and removed his hat respectfully. "Good afternoon, sir." The farmer rested both hands upon the axe handle and studied the young stranger without speaking. "My name is Nathan Hale," Nathaniel said. "I've come seeking honest work, and your permission to court your daughter, Elena." The request hung quietly between them. The farmer neither laughed nor frowned. Instead, he looked directly into Nathaniel's eyes with calm patience earned through decades beneath unforgiving skies. "What makes you think you're ready for my daughter?" Nathaniel answered truthfully. "I don't know that I am. I hoped you might allow me the chance to prove it." The old farmer smiled faintly. "Most men begin by listing what they own. I've learned possessions can disappear. And what remains?" Nathaniel hesitated only briefly. "The man." The farmer nodded thoughtfully before speaking words Nathaniel would remember forever. "My daughter doesn't need a rich man or a handsome one." He pointed toward endless fields stretching beneath the afternoon sun. "She needs the man who'll still choose her after the harvest fails." Silence settled over them. Nathaniel had attended coronations, negotiated treaties, and spoken before thousands, yet nothing anyone had ever said struck his heart as deeply as those simple words. Instead of pleading further, he bowed his head. "If you cannot trust me with your daughter, Perhaps you'll trust me with tomorrow's chores. The old farmer chuckled quietly. Can you split wood? I can learn. Repair fences? I'll try. Rise before daylight? I already have. The farmer finally extended a weathered hand. My name's Elijah Whitfield. Work honestly, eat honestly. We'll see what kind of man you are. Nathaniel accepted the handshake with genuine gratitude. Before entering the farmhouse, Elijah called gently toward the open doorway. Elena. A young woman stepped into the fading sunlight wearing a simple cream-colored dress dusted lightly with flour. Loose chestnut curls framed thoughtful hazel eyes that held neither shyness nor pride, only quiet curiosity. She looked first at her father, then toward the unfamiliar ranch hand standing beside him. Nathaniel expected surprise, perhaps suspicion. Instead, she offered a warm smile that carried no trace of calculation. We've another pair of hands, Elijah said. Elena nodded as though welcoming strangers had always been natural. Then we'd better set another place for supper. That evening laughter drifted through the humble farmhouse while candles flickered across rough wooden walls. After the meal, Nathaniel quietly noticed Elena slip outside carrying 2 covered baskets. Curious, he followed at a respectful distance until he saw her leave them upon the porch of an aging widow whose garden had withered beneath the relentless summer heat. Elena knocked once, then disappeared into the darkness before the grateful woman opened her door. Nathaniel remained hidden beneath the old oak tree, watching moonlight fall across the empty path where Elena had stood only moments before. She had given away food her own family could scarcely spare, expecting neither praise nor recognition. In that silent act, the disguised Duke realized the journey he believed would test one remarkable woman had already begun transforming the man who came seeking her. Morning arrived long before the sun. Nathaniel rose with Elijah each day while the stars still lingered above the valley, discovering that farm life allowed no room for comfort or excuses. Every fence demanded repair, every animal required care, and every acre rewarded only steady hands. Muscles that had once known sword practice and horseback hunts now ached from lifting stones, hauling water, chopping timber, and turning stubborn earth beneath an unforgiving sky. Each evening he collapsed into the barn loft exhausted, yet he slept more peacefully than he ever had inside silk-draped chambers. The Whitfields never treated him like a guest. They treated him like family expected to carry his share. Elijah corrected mistakes without cruelty. His wife, Margaret, quietly slipped extra bread onto Nathaniel's plate whenever she noticed his appetite growing with the labor. Elena worked beside everyone else, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands stained with soil instead of perfume. Nathaniel admired that she never asked others to complete tasks she refused herself. Days gradually turned into weeks. Without realizing it, Nathaniel stopped thinking like a duke measuring productivity and began thinking like a farmer measuring seasons. Rain mattered more than politics. Healthy calves became reasons for celebration. A repaired roof meant another family would remain warm through winter. Wealth suddenly seemed less impressive than resilience. One afternoon, while repairing an old fence together, Nathaniel finally asked Elijah why Elena had refused so many prosperous suitors. The old farmer paused before answering. Because she has already seen what happens when wealth forgets honor. That evening, sitting quietly beneath an ancient oak overlooking fading wheat fields, Elena chose to tell the rest herself. Years earlier, her younger sister Rose had fallen deeply in love with the son of a wealthy grain merchant. He promised marriage before witnesses, filled her heart with dreams, then abandoned her when a richer alliance appeared in another county. Gossip spread faster than truth. Rose endured humiliation she never deserved. Though the family stood beside her, shame and heartbreak weakened her spirit until illness claimed her before her 20th birthday. Elena looked across the fields without shedding a tear. I buried my sister, she whispered. Not because a poor man failed her, but because a wealthy one believed promises were cheaper than kindness. Nathaniel felt those words settle heavily inside him. He carried a title representing generations of privilege. For the first time, he wondered how many unseen wounds people associated with men like him. Summer grew harsher. Clouds gathered without releasing rain. Creeks narrowed into cracked ribbons of mud. Corn leaves curled beneath relentless heat. The valley's wheat slowly faded from hopeful green to anxious gold. Families began calculating which livestock they could no longer afford to feed. Children fetched water from wells sinking lower each morning. Fear arrived quietly then refused to leave. No one welcomed the drought more eagerly than Silas Mercer. The wealthy ranch owner rode through neighboring farms offering generous smiles and pitiful prices for desperate land. He spoke of helping struggling families while collecting signatures that transferred generations of hard work into his growing estate. Some accepted because hunger leaves little room for pride. The Whitfields refused every offer. Silas eventually arrived at their porch himself, dressed in expensive riding clothes untouched by dust. He greeted Elijah politely before turning toward Elena. "I'll forgive every debt your family owes." She folded her arms calmly. "We owe you nothing. You soon will." His smile barely changed. "Marry me, Elena. Your parents will never fear another failed harvest." Silence settled across the yard. Nathaniel watched from the barn, forcing himself to remain only another hired hand. Elena stepped forward. "If protecting my family requires selling myself, then we were poor long before this drought." Silas's pleasant expression vanished. "You'll regret refusing practical solutions." "No," she answered steadily. "Only dishonest ones." He rode away without another word, but the dust rising behind his horse carried an unmistakable warning. That night Nathaniel studied forgotten maps Elijah kept inside an old wooden chest. One brittle parchment showed a creek abandoned decades earlier after flooding altered its course. He spent hours comparing elevations before quietly approaching neighboring farmers with an impossible idea. Instead of praying for rain, they would bring water themselves. No speeches inspired them. No promises guaranteed success. Nathaniel simply lifted the first shovel. One farmer joined him. Then another. Soon dozens gathered beneath lantern light after finishing their daily labor. Men dug beside women. Older children carried stones while younger ones filled buckets. Night after night they carved narrow channels through stubborn ground, following Nathaniel's careful measurements without realizing the education guiding his plans came from royal engineers once hired by Ashcroft Estates. Elena worked beside him until her palms blistered. When everyone finally rested near midnight, she noticed blood seeping through Nathaniel's gloves. Without asking permission, she led him to the farmhouse porch. She washed his torn hands with cool water drawn from the nearly empty well. Her touch remained gentle, steady, almost reverent. "You hide pain well," she said softly. "I've had practice." "So have I." Their eyes met beneath flickering lantern light. Neither reached for words capable of explaining the quiet bond growing between them. They simply shared the silence. 3 days later, children shouted from the southern fields. Water spilled through the newly carved channels, sparkling beneath brilliant morning sunlight before spreading across thirsty farmland. Farmers laughed openly. Mothers wept without embarrassment. Tiny seedlings lifted as though the earth itself had taken a grateful breath. Hope returned to Whitfield Valley, carried not by miracle alone, but by neighbors who had refused to surrender each other. Standing atop a distant ridge, Silas Mercer watched the flowing water with narrowed eyes. He had expected desperation to divide the valley. Instead, one unknown ranch hand had united it. As his horse turned toward town, Silas made a quiet decision that chilled him far more deeply than any drought ever could. The stranger would not live long enough to see another harvest. Before sunrise on the 7th morning after water returned to the valley, hoofbeats shattered the fragile peace surrounding the Whitfield farm. Sheriff Amos Carter rode into the yard accompanied by 4 armed deputies whose grim expressions warned that kindness had no place in their visit. Elijah stepped from the barn, Margaret hurried onto the porch, and Elena emerged from the farmhouse doorway just as Nathaniel set aside the axe he had been sharpening. No one spoke until the sheriff unfolded an official warrant bearing the county seal. "Nathan Hale," he announced, "you are under arrest for the theft of 6 prize horses belonging to Silas Mercer." The accusation struck the family like lightning. Nathaniel neither protested nor stepped backward. Instead, he calmly offered his wrists before anyone could seize him. Elena stared in disbelief. "That cannot be true." Sheriff Carter's face revealed little emotion. "We found stolen saddles hidden inside the barn loft where he sleeps." Nathaniel understood immediately. Someone had placed them there during the previous night's irrigation patrol. Silas had finally made his move. The deputies searched the loft again, producing bridles engraved with Mercer's brand. Whispering neighbors gathered outside the fences as the news spread from farm to farm. Faces once filled with gratitude now reflected suspicion. The stranger who had united the valley suddenly appeared capable of betraying it. Elijah looked directly into Nathaniel's eyes. "Did you do this?" Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "No." The old farmer nodded once. "Then that's enough for me." Those simple words carried more trust than any title Nathaniel had ever inherited. As the deputies led him toward the waiting wagon, Elena stepped beside him. "I'll prove they're lying." Nathaniel met her determined gaze. "Be careful." She frowned. "That's all you have to say?" He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to reveal that one command from him could summon judges, soldiers, and the full authority of Ashcroft Hall. Instead he simply smiled. The truth has patient feet. The jail stood inside the neighboring town, its thick stone walls trapping both heat and despair. Nathaniel's narrow cell contained little beyond a wooden cot and a tiny barred window overlooking the dusty street. Each evening he listened to wagons rumble past while wondering whether silence remained the right choice. It did. An elderly stable keeper named Thomas Avery had secretly witnessed Mercer's hired men planting the stolen equipment inside the Whitfield barn. Before dawn, one frightened message reached Nathaniel through the sheriff. Silas had discovered Thomas saw everything. If the old man testified, hired killers would burn his cottage with him inside. Nathaniel could end the nightmare instantly by revealing his identity. Mercer would retreat before a duke. Yet Thomas would die before protection arrived. Nathaniel chose disgrace instead. Outside the jail, Elena refused surrender. She borrowed a sturdy mare, packed bread, water, and a notebook, then began riding from ranch to ranch despite scorching days and storm-filled nights. She questioned blacksmiths, stable hands, merchants, and drovers who regularly crossed county lines. Piece by piece, a hidden pattern emerged. Families forced to sell their farms had all borrowed money through companies secretly controlled by Silas Mercer. Survey maps had been altered. Debt records had vanished. Witnesses remembered strangers moving horses shortly before Nathaniel's arrest. Truth waited beneath layers of fear. Mercer's men soon realized Elena was asking dangerous questions. One evening, 2 riders followed her through a pine forest. She urged her horse faster, weaving between narrow trails until rain transformed the ground into slippery clay. A fallen branch blocked the path ahead. Before panic overtook her, another rider burst from the trees. Gray-haired Arthur Pembroke, traveling under the guise of an ordinary merchant, positioned his horse between Elena and the pursuers. Without drawing unnecessary attention, he delayed them long enough for Elena to escape. She thanked the stranger, never realizing she had just met the Duke's loyal steward. Arthur merely tipped his hat. "Keep chasing the truth, miss." She never forgot his words. Days later, Elena uncovered the final proof inside the abandoned office of a dismissed land surveyor. Hidden beneath loose floorboards lay duplicate contracts bearing forged signatures and payment records connecting Mercer's ranch foreman to the horse thieves. She rode through relentless rain to deliver everything directly to Sheriff Carter before anyone could destroy the evidence. The sheriff examined each document carefully. His expression hardened. That same afternoon, deputies arrested 2 of Mercer's hired criminals. Faced with overwhelming proof, both confessed to stealing the horses, planting the saddles, and accepting payment from Silas Mercer himself. Thomas Avery finally found courage to testify publicly. Mercer's carefully constructed empire collapsed within hours. Nathaniel walked free beneath bright autumn sunshine. The townspeople gathered outside the jail in embarrassed silence. Men who had doubted him lowered their eyes. Women who had whispered rumors quietly apologized. Even Sheriff Carter removed his hat. "I judged evidence," he admitted, "but not character." Nathaniel accepted every apology with calm grace. Resentment would only poison the justice already won. Elena crossed the crowded street without hesitation and stopped before him. For a long moment neither spoke. Then she reached for his roughened hands, still marked by labor and imprisonment alike. "I never stopped believing you." Nathaniel's voice softened. "You carried that belief farther than I deserved." They began walking home together beneath skies finally washed clean by rain. Along the lonely road, Nathaniel slipped one hand into his saddlebag and wrapped trembling fingers around the hidden Ashcroft signet ring. One confession could explain every mystery, erase every doubt, and change both their futures forever. He almost drew it into the light. Then he looked toward Elena, who smiled at him with quiet affection earned before crowns, titles, or fortunes had entered her heart. Nathaniel closed his hand again, unaware that far beyond the valley royal riders had already begun searching every county for their missing duke. Autumn arrived carrying cool mornings, amber leaves, and fields finally heavy with grain. The irrigation channels carved by determined hands had transformed despair into abundance, and every family in Whitfield Valley celebrated a harvest they had once believed impossible. Wagons overflowed with wheat. Smoke curled peacefully from farmhouse chimneys. Children's laughter echoed across hills that only weeks before had seemed destined for silence. Yet among all the blessings the season delivered, None brought greater joy to Elijah and Margaret Whitfield than watching Elena smile without the shadow of old grief lingering behind her eyes. Nathaniel worked beside the family from dawn until dusk exactly as he had on his first day. Though the false accusation had nearly destroyed his place among them, he returned to every chore without bitterness. He repaired fences broken during summer storms, stacked fresh hay inside the barn, and helped neighboring widows gather their harvest before early frost could claim it. The valley no longer saw him as a wandering laborer. They saw him as one of their own. One evening, after the final wagon rolled safely into the Whitfield barn, Nathaniel found Elijah sitting alone upon the porch, watching the last sunlight settle across endless golden fields. The old farmer rested weathered hands upon his knees, contentment softening every line carved by years of labor. Nathaniel removed his hat before speaking. "Mr. Whitfield, I've come to ask you once more for permission to marry your daughter." Elijah studied him for several quiet moments. Months earlier he had seen only an unfamiliar young man wearing worn clothes. Now he saw someone who had stood beside his family through drought, disgrace, exhausting labor and uncertain hope without asking for reward. "You remember what I told you the day we met?" Nathaniel nodded. "You said Elena needed the man who would still choose her after the harvest failed. And what happened when it nearly did?" "I stayed." Elijah smiled warmly. "No." He slowly rose to his feet. "You belonged." Without another word, the old farmer embraced him like the son he had never expected to gain. "You have my blessing." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by gratitude more precious than every honor ever granted at court. When Elena learned her father's answer, joyful tears filled her eyes before laughter chased them away. She threw her arms around both parents, then turned toward Nathaniel with quiet happiness shining across her face. Neither needed grand declarations. Their love had grown through shared work, shared burdens, and shared faith. The wedding was set for the following Saturday inside the small white church that generations of Valley families had called sacred. Preparations united the entire community. Women baked fresh bread and berry pies through the night. Children gathered wildflowers from nearby meadows. Farmers repaired loose boards along the church steps. Margaret carefully altered her own wedding veil so Elena could wear it. Nothing about the celebration promised luxury. Everything about it promised sincerity. Far beyond Whitfield Valley, however, another search quietly reached its conclusion. Arthur Pembroke finally located his missing master after months of careful silence. Rather than interfering immediately, he sent discreet messages to Ashcroft Hall explaining everything Nathaniel had chosen to become. The royal council insisted the Duke return at once, warning that state matters could wait no longer. Arthur answered with unusual firmness. Then the kingdom must attend his wedding. At sunrise on the appointed day, church bells began ringing across the valley. Guests arrived in wagons decorated with autumn branches and ribbons woven from dried wheat. Elena stood inside the small church wearing a graceful ivory gown sewn lovingly by neighboring women. Margaret fastened the restored family veil beneath her daughter's softly gathered chestnut hair. "You look beautiful," she whispered. Elena smiled. "I feel blessed." Outside, Nathaniel waited beneath the old maple tree beside the church entrance. He wore the same simple suit borrowed from another farmer because he refused to replace honesty with unnecessary display before vows were spoken. Then distant thunder rolled across the countryside. It was not weather. It was horses. Villagers turned toward the winding road as elegant black carriages emerged one after another beyond the hills, each bearing the unmistakable silver crest of House Ashcroft. Behind them rode hundreds of mounted royal guards in polished uniforms that flashed beneath the autumn sun. Their disciplined formation stretched farther than anyone could see. Confusion swept through the valley. Children stopped laughing. Mothers gathered families closer. Even Sheriff Carter looked uncertain. Silas Mercer, awaiting formal sentencing under guard nearby, laughed bitterly. "I warned you the stranger wasn't who he claimed." He lifted his chained hands toward the approaching soldiers. "They've come to arrest him again." The lead carriage stopped before the church. Arthur Pembroke stepped down first, dressed once more as the distinguished steward of Ashcroft Hall. Behind him came the captain of the Royal Guard. Every soldier dismounted simultaneously. Silence settled across the valley. The captain approached Nathaniel, removed his ceremonial hat, and dropped to one knee. "Your Grace," he declared, his voice carrying across every waiting field, "the Council of Ashcroft humbly welcomes home Duke Nathaniel Ashcroft." Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Margaret covered her mouth. Sheriff Carter lowered his head. Elijah stood perfectly still. Nathaniel slowly reached into his coat and withdrew the signet ring hidden since the day he left the palace. Sunlight caught the engraved Ashcroft crest as he slipped it onto his finger. Then he turned, not toward the soldiers but toward the Whitfield family. "I came asking permission as an ordinary man because titles can open doors that character never earns," he said quietly. "I wanted to know whether I deserved your trust before anyone offered me respect." His eyes found Elena. "I came searching for a wife." He stepped closer. "I found a family." Tears streamed freely down Elijah's weathered face. He embraced Nathaniel exactly as he had the night before, proving that nothing had changed except the truth everyone else finally understood. Elena reached for Nathaniel's hand without hesitation, her fingers wrapping naturally around the hand that now carried both calluses and a duke's ring. As church bells rang once more and the royal guards formed a silent honor corridor, every person present realized they were about to witness far more than a wedding. They were about to discover whether love chosen in humility could survive the weight of a crown. The church bells continued ringing long after the vows were spoken, yet no one in Whitfield Valley remembered the sound as clearly as the silence that followed them. Noble officers, village farmers, traveling merchants, and curious children all stood together beneath the autumn sky, watching Duke Nathaniel Ashcroft and his new Duchess walk down the narrow stone path hand in hand. Their steps were unhurried, their smiles genuine, and despite the rows of royal guards surrounding them, they looked exactly as they had the previous day. A hard-working ranch hand and the farmer's daughter who had loved him before she knew his name. That image spread across the county faster than any proclamation issued by the crown. The council expected Nathaniel to return immediately to Ashcroft Hall and resume the endless responsibilities waiting beyond the valley. Instead, he made a decision that astonished both nobles and commoners alike. He thanked the royal escort for their loyalty, dismissed most of the guards, and announced that he and Elena would spend the first year of their marriage dividing every season between the ducal estate and the Whitfield farm. Some aristocrats quietly called the decision beneath his dignity. Nathaniel merely smiled whenever such criticism reached him. "A title cannot grow grain," he answered. "The hands that feed the kingdom deserve to know the man who governs it." True to his word, the Duke returned to the fields only days after the wedding. He harvested wheat beside Elijah, repaired wagons with neighboring farmers, and shared simple meals around the same rough wooden table where he had first eaten as a stranger. Elena remained exactly as she had always been. She still rose before sunrise to knead bread, still carried baskets of vegetables to elderly neighbors, and still refused to let servants replace the quiet acts of kindness that had shaped her life. Palace attendants who accompanied the couple found themselves learning how to milk cows, stack hay, and gather eggs instead of standing stiffly beside polished walls. Before long, laughter replaced awkwardness, and barriers that had separated noble households from ordinary farms slowly disappeared. News of the Duke's unusual life spread across the kingdom. Curious visitors traveled for days expecting to witness a grand display of wealth. Instead, they found Nathaniel carrying heavy sacks of grain across muddy fields while Elena tied her apron and stirred soup inside the same humble kitchen where she had welcomed him months before. Travelers returned home telling stories not of jewels or banquets, but of a ruler who paused to mend broken fences for widows and played games with barefoot children after the day's labor ended. Those stories reached villages that had never before spoken of the crown with affection. Yet Nathaniel had not forgotten the suffering he had witnessed during the drought. He remembered frightened families signing away generations of hard work because they had no other choice. He remembered empty wells, cracked fields, and parents pretending they were not hungry so their children could eat. More than anything, he remembered Silas Mercer's confidence that desperation could always be purchased. The memory refused to leave him, and Elena understood why. One winter evening, while snow settled quietly beyond the windows of Ashcroft Hall, Nathaniel invited farmers, surveyors, judges, engineers, and village elders from every corner of the county to the great council chamber. Instead of placing nobles closest to him, he seated working families beside the highest officials. Some members of the aristocracy looked offended, but Nathaniel ignored their discomfort. For 2 days he listened rather than spoke. Farmers described crops destroyed by floods and droughts. Widows explained how dishonest contracts had stolen land their husbands had cultivated for decades. Village blacksmiths spoke about families selling tools simply to buy bread. Elena listened beside him, occasionally adding gentle observations drawn from her own experiences. When every voice had finally been heard, Nathaniel rose. He announced the Harvest Protection Act. No landowner would ever again seize a family's farm during declared natural disasters. Emergency grain reserves would be established throughout the kingdom. Low-interest royal loans would replace predatory private debts. Every land purchase completed during declared emergencies would face immediate judicial review. Irrigation canals would receive royal funding instead of relying upon desperate volunteers. The chamber fell silent. Some wealthy landowners protested immediately, claiming the reforms threatened commerce and property rights. Nathaniel allowed each objection to be heard without interruption. When they finished, he walked to the great window overlooking snow-covered fields. "I have stood where hungry fathers stand," he said quietly. "I have watched mothers hide empty plates from their children. A kingdom exists to protect its people, not profit from their despair. If any law serves wealth while abandoning justice, then the law must change." No one challenged him again. Within months, engineers expanded irrigation systems throughout neighboring counties using the same principles Nathaniel had first applied beside Elijah's forgotten map. Reservoirs were repaired. Community grain houses were built. Villages once separated by suspicion began sharing resources before hardship became disaster. Harvests grew stronger each passing season, and thousands of families who might once have lost everything remained secure upon their own land. Justice also reached Silas Mercer. Many demanded imprisonment. Others called for permanent exile. Nathaniel chose another path. Standing before the county court, he addressed the disgraced ranch owner without anger. "You believed the land existed to enrich one man." Silas lowered his eyes. "You will now spend the next 10 years rebuilding the lives you tried to destroy." His sentence required him to oversee irrigation construction under constant supervision, working beside the very farming communities he had exploited. Every canal restored another field. Every repaired bridge connected another village. Every sunrise reminded him that authority earned through fear disappears, while respect earned through service endures. The punishment humbled him far more deeply than a prison cell ever could. Years passed with quiet purpose. Elijah's hair turned completely white. Margaret moved more slowly through the farmhouse, though her laughter remained unchanged. Nathaniel and Elena welcomed 3 children into their family: Thomas, Grace, and little Samuel, each growing equally comfortable inside palace libraries and muddy wheat fields. They learned to ride horses before they could properly write their names and to greet shepherds with the same respect shown to visiting ambassadors. Every spring the family returned to Whitfield Valley for planting season. It became an unbreakable tradition. Nathaniel insisted on guiding the first plow across the field beside Elijah, while Elena planted the opening row of seeds with Margaret. Their children eagerly followed behind, dropping kernels into freshly turned earth with tiny dirt-covered hands. Villagers gathered each year not because protocol required it, but because witnessing the Duke's return reminded them that goodness could survive power. The Whitfield farm gradually became known throughout the kingdom as the house where the Duke learned humility. Poets wrote about it. Travelers sketched it. Teachers told its story to children who had never seen the valley. Visitors expecting marble fountains instead discovered weathered fences, flowering gardens, and a kitchen forever scented with fresh bread. One golden evening, many years after the wedding that had astonished the kingdom, Nathaniel stood beside Elijah watching another harvest glow beneath the setting sun. Their grandchildren chased butterflies through the wheat while Elena and Margaret laughed together on the farmhouse porch. Little Thomas looked up at his father with innocent curiosity. "Why do you still work here when everyone says you're the Duke?" Nathaniel rested one hand upon the boy's shoulder before looking toward Elijah, whose weathered face carried the quiet satisfaction of a life honestly lived. "Because long before anyone called me Your Grace," he answered, "your grandfather asked me a question no king had ever dared ask." He smiled at Elena, whose eyes still held the same gentle warmth that had welcomed a dusty stranger years before. He said his daughter didn't need a rich man. She needed a good one who would stay after the harvest failed. Nathaniel gazed across the endless fields where everything had begun. "I have spent every day since trying to deserve the answer she gave." As the last rays of sunlight poured across the valley, 3 generations of one family stood together among the ripened wheat, proving that kingdoms are not transformed by crowns, castles, or armies. They are transformed when one humble act of trust inspires a single good man to become the ruler his people always deserved.